Good afternoon. Very glad to have Robert Hass here from Berkeley, California. We were lucky to be able to arrange for him to be here because he's rarely in the East, but he is going to be doing a one-week residency at Columbia University starting tomorrow. He's the author of 2 books of poetry, first of which entitled Field Guide, which was the Yale Younger Poets Award book, and then second volume entitled Praise. He's also published a wonderful book of criticism called 20th Century Pleasures, which received the 1984 American Book Critics Circle Award. He's also received a Guggenheim Fellowship, a MacArthur Fellowship, and is a very, very wonderful poet. So at this time I'm glad to be able to present Robert Hass to you.
We were talking about region, about the definite way in which this area is a region, defined by anthracite coal and by a history to do with it, and specific geographies of place. And thinking about that, I was trying to think about what to read or how to enter a dialogue with that. And I suppose the first thing that occurred to me was the way in which, for me, California was a region. And I suppose one of the things about a region is that it's almost always, among other things, also a province. That everything is a region because it's somehow related to New York or Boston or someplace that's supposedly the real place. That they're not quite real place in relation to. And the way that was true for me was that textbooks still came from the East. So, you know, Dick and Jane got up in the morning and put on their snow suits and went outside. And so I always had the vague sense that there was something wrong with my life, that it didn't have real things like that in it. And some part of my impulse in writing, I suppose, was to say the names of my places and to talk about their history. All the more so because California is both a young place and a place in which history almost doesn't exist, so easily forgotten. And, you know, in my childhood, everything was changing so fast. Real estate developers are giving everything names so fast, usually colorful Spanish names. There's a Mount Diablo not far from where I live, Devil's Mountain, right? That they actually called one tract Santa Diablo until somebody explained to them what it meant. Anyway, I taught in Buffalo, New York for a while, and it was a time, and I tried to apply the method of the earlier poems to that place, partly because I was teaching there, and I was teaching a lot of Polish-American kids, working class backgrounds who grew up in that town. And many of them lived on streets named after poets and revolutionaries who they had never heard of. They came from immigrant families, not especially well educated. They had very little sense of Polish history. They knew that Polish culture was a sort of joke in America. And anyway, this poem comes out of that, and it also comes out of my stunned Westerner's look at a landscape that's not so different from this one. For me, coming from a place where the summers were very brown, the density and intensity of the green of eastern summers was completely magical. And that's where this poem begins, and it's called Lament for the Poles of Buffalo. It's a longish poem. It's an effort to think about the history of a place. It's in parts. Tell you how many parts so you know when. 7 parts. And this was written during the period of the Vietnam War and the demonstrations around the time the students were killed at Kent State. So that politics gets mixed up in it too, because it fascinated me that that these extremely conservative, anti-communist supporters of the war in Vietnam, who were sending their children off to be killed in it, had been the revolutionary class in Eastern Europe 2 generations before. 1. These green New York State summers, foreign and magical to me as novels were when younger I read long afternoons of seedling and ripe harvest, marshes where your masters hunted snipe, Sloe and Zubrovka gathered from the fields to scent their vodka. There was snow and deep spring seepage that heaved green through 3 hot months in the 4 olive volumes of The Peasants by Ladislas Raymond, Nobel Prize-winning novel of the 1920s, which I had in a little set of 4 books. The 4 olive volumes of The Peasants by Ladislas Raymond. They had not much likeness to my Coast Range hills tawny with wild oat or the valley farms brown-bodied in the August heat. You were twice translated. English for a music I had never heard, rain for snow, teal and canvasback for snipe. Now my eye finds you where brown haze dissolves the lucid sky lakeward and riverward. Smokestacks, steel, threads of smoke westering. I think these days of Esterhazy and his serfs. Up here it is intensely green, suburban. I follow muskrat paths toward streams along the meadow where bittersweet nightshade grows violet thick. Yellow pistils dart from the petals like tiny tongues. The ovaries swell lazily toward pale sepals on the underside. He owned 100,000 Polish souls, Esterhazy, Haydn's patron. Catherine of Russia gave him 20,000 once, men and women, your parents probably, because he had such grace in flattery. Mr. Lewandowski, Mrs. Slaminsky, congressman and the head of the city council in Buffalo. I toss hard words at you from here on Chestnut Ridge, white Anglo-Saxon words, heavy, strange as buckshot on the tongues of your grandfathers. 2. It's an account of the first white man to settle this area. When Elias Crockett hauled his life up narrow canyons of the Genesee, a pair of huge, gentle, brown-eyed oxen bore the load, wife, tools, a millstone. He settled Lake Erie's northeast shore. Buffalo Creek was low in early fall. He unyoked, unpacked, and one of the beasts he butchered on the spot and very agreeably ate. There was no unkindness in it. They were not his kind. Flames leaped to lick the marbled crusts of fat. The thick steaks were incense in the air. Your families came later from coal pits and burrows of Pennsylvania looking for work above the ground. Their eyes adjusted briefly to the light. Crockett owned the general store. I could say Scranton owned the general store. You get the 3. I testified last week before your grand jury. They wanted me to name your children's names in a building full of classical representations of justice and various insignia of the not quite extinct Iroquois. Old fears. If the Easter candle is extinguished, the buckwheat will not grow. Never slice a melon on the Baptist day. Beware the blood-dark mark that stains the breasts of Jews. They asked me for the names of Jews, now that English vowels in your mouths are nasalized at home flat as pellets doctors dug out of student skulls last spring. Bitter, they rose up against the war they've watched you wear gladly these 5 years, like your old master's cast-off coat. So summer comes again, the elms in full leaf imitate cathedrals as we planned. The sick elms. Can you hear me all right? Okay. You plan Free Eastern Europe Day, these desperate evenings when the Sunday New York Times seems thinner than the air and less alive with the communicable anguish and boredom of the city. I wander in the woods like the literary peasants of the 19th century, who for eternity will gather mushrooms in the forests of Lithuania at dawn. Mickiewicz, your epic poet. Mickiewicz is the Shakespeare of Polish literature. Very great, wonderful poet. Mickiewicz, your epic poet, describes each fungus by its wine-glass shape, recalls the clear, fragile crystal whose cold touch the horny fingers of your forebears never knew. Morals for Burgundy, and for champagne, the pale, upswept cups of chanterelles. It's a lovely, very famous passage in his poem, Pantadeusz. He describes the peasants out picking mushrooms in the Lithuanian forest early in the morning. And he describes each mushroom by comparing it to the shape of the wine glass that you would drink a particular wine out of. He runs through a list of about 10 mushrooms in 10 different kinds of glasses that you drink wine from. And of course, none of these peasants ever drank wine in their lives, let alone wine from an elegant crystal wine glass. I dreamed this dream of late winter at Crystal Beach, where the old amusement park is dying like the lake, a wilderness of huge frozen drifts of snow. We ran, my son and I, toward harder ice in long blue shadows from the early sun, sinking and clambering. Out as far as it was safe to go, an old woman and her husband, bundled there in coarse gray wool, were sitting on a tarp. She spoke to me in Polish or Russian. I knew who she was, but I couldn't say. We were at the edge of things, pointing west toward deep water and the point. She smiled and spoke again. Her eyes welled tears against the cold. We looked, white over white soaring, churned water, gray, blue-gray, and just above, in swarms, gulls, golden eyes, and mute, fantastic swans. The next day I remembered who she was, Grushenka. That was their dream if they escaped America. I knew when I first read the Brothers Karamazov, 18 years old and on another coast, that they had come here, that their great heat burned here. I didn't wonder then what they had come to. I have loved your ancestors in books. The peasants of Europe stirred there and sang and killed. Summer meadows of an older wisdom, our communal guilt, forgiveness, new justice, and the black earth. There was dawn sun on snow at the end of the Brothers Karamazov, and the children, remembering their dead ones, cried, "Hurrah!" And you still have the old servility. You don't even own the city where the landlords let you play at politics. It's not your wealth that gathers to a foulness in the air. Your shit and their sludge commingle in the lake, married in dead salmon and poisoned roe. Only the houses. I have come to like the houses, warm against winter, slack-jawed in summer as they settle on the lawns, new sphinxes of the riddle of sheer bulk. Evenings, life issues from them, and nights, the lights go out in windows down the block. I have a friend who says he pities you at night, thinking of the Catholic Church and all the dirty books in corners of the corner stores. and I am sorry that you suffered joy in shame. It wasn't so in the poets. They envied your bodies. They envied your marriage to a land they merely owned. They feared and hungered, knowing that you would one day rise up. This patriotism, this is part 6. Commissioners of bad streets, a grubby park. I notice there's no statue there of stiff-armed George. Even the history of this city breeds a comic opera melancholy like some poor poet's life. Stiff-armed George was the Seneca who wandered into Buffalo, ponderously drunk a day in 1802, and stabbed 2 white men, whittlers, on the trading office steps. George was arrested. The loafers from the steps were tended to, and a garrison from Fort Niagara was stationed here. Law and order. The settlers flocked in. Crockett throve, but not before Red Jacket, the Cato of the Iroquois, had led his braves to town and delivered a defense. He talked 8 hours in the sun, marshaling his periods in a tongue no white man this side of Montreal could understand. Your founding father, stiff-armed George, was hanged. 7. He still lives here. He is your sons. Bored or at war, they wander through the streets. They want Lake Erie's shore and peace. They wear your pride, justice, and black earth, and you do not forgive. They dream of Indians as the landlords and poets of Poland dreamed of you. It is an ancient imagination, and it begets this order with the random symmetries of mallow poppies in the field, the dying and green leafing of the grass, meadows crackling in the midday heat, alive with seed. It translates easily. Well, that poem felt appropriate to read up here because it's a sort of sermon, isn't it, to those people. I sure told them, didn't I? It was actually a very terrifying time because I was a faculty advisor to the Students for a Democratic Society at the university, and so when the grand jury wanted to investigate the radical anti-war activities of the students, they subpoenaed me as the faculty advisor to come and bring all the records of the student organization. Of course, there were no records as far as I know. This, you know what it means to be a faculty advisor. Somebody comes and says, would you sign this? And I did it. Anyway, I thought I'd better get a lawyer, so I called a young lawyer who was supposed to be the hot liberal lawyer in Buffalo, and he said, well, this is like the old days if you were a communist. And I said, I'm a communist. This is Buffalo in 1967 or something like that. And from which he took me to be saying I was a communist. In fact, at that time, it was, I thought the communists were sort of to the right of the Democrats. But anyway, he immediately had a subpoena, tried to get the subpoena quashed on the grounds that I was a member of the Communist Party and didn't want to give evidence that I don't know what, proved that anyway, so there was a thing in the newspaper that night about my being a communist, and we started getting telephone calls in which whispery voices would just describe the walk our children took home from school. Just pick up the phone, a voice would say, down Elmwood, 3 blocks, turn left onto Hurdle, 2 blocks, turn right onto Ashland, 2 blocks, 576 Ashland. Click. Hang up the phone. So I was mad at the people there. At the end of that poem, I described some idea of an imagination of a natural order, or some casual mix of cultivation and wildness. Like the old imagination of Polish Romantic literature, of American literature. This order with the random symmetries of mallow poppies in the field, the dying and green leaving of the grass, meadows crackling in the midday heat, alive with seed. And then I said, it translates easily. And that was when you actually write a book, then you start noticing things like that. And then I walked around for a while saying, does it really translate easily? Why is there this war then if it translates so easily? So the first poem in my next book is a sort of recantation of that. And it's about a Japanese movie called Seven Samurai by Kurosawa. The title of the poem is Heroic Simile, which refers to those big, energetic metaphors in Homer. Everything is in action. It's one of the things I love about him as a poet is that in his poems, he never says, the warrior fell like a tree. He says, the warrior fell like a tree, and it fell in somebody's yard, and they got into an argument, so both families had to go into town, and they got their carts, and as they were going into town, so on. The world is process. The world is just pure energy constantly transforming us. When the swordsman fell in Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, in the gray rain, in CinemaScope and the Tokugawa dynasty, he fell straight as a pine. He fell as Ajax fell in Homer, enchanted dactyls, and the tree was so huge the woodsman returned for 2 days to that lucky place before he was done with the sawing, and on the third day he brought his uncle. You following me? I wish I were in a little closer contact. In this movie, which is maybe certainly one of the most wonderful movies ever made, there is this sensational swordsman who, in one of the last scenes of the film, is shot by one of the first rifles to enter Tokugawa, Japan. Signals really the end of feudalism and the beginning of another kind of order, in the rain. This guy's devoted his life to this art of swordsmanship, which is about to become antique, and gets shot and he falls in the rain. And what happens to me is that thinking about it, I sort of fall into the place where the swordsman has been transformed into a tree, and there are a couple of peasants, one trying to figure out what the hell to do with this tree. Which was a way of posing to myself the problem of is it really so easy to translate that stuff back into life? Which is the problem of all of our deepest and best feelings. How do you take them into the rest of life? How do you take art into the rest of life? When the swordsman fell in Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, in the gray rain, in CinemaScope and the Tokugawa dynasty, he fell straight as a pine. He fell as Ajax fell in Homer, enchanted dactyls, and the tree was so huge, the woodsman returned to that place for 2 days before he was done with the sawing, and on the third day he brought his uncle. They stacked logs in the resinous air, hacking the small limbs off, tying those bundles separately. The slabs near the root were quartered, and still they were awkwardly large. The logs from mid-tree they halved, 10 bundles in 4 great piles of fragrant wood, moons and quarter moons and half moons ridged by the saw's tooth. The woodsman and the old man, his uncle, are standing in mid-forest on a floor of pine silt and spring mud. They have stopped working because they are tired and because I have imagined no pack animal or primitive wagon. They're too canny to call in neighbors and come home with a few logs after 3 days' work. They're waiting for me to do something, or for the overseer of the great Lord to come and arrest them. How patient they are. The old man smokes a pipe and spits. The young man is thinking he would be rich if he were already rich and had a mule. 10 days of hauling, and on the 7th they'll probably be caught, go home empty-handed or worse. I don't know whether they're Japanese or Mycenaean, and there's nothing I can do. The path from here to that village is not translated. A hero dying gives off stillness to the air. A man and a woman walk from the movies to the house in the silence of separate fidelities. There are limits to imagination. What happens to me in that poem is that the floor falls out, and one after another of those moments of transformation just hovers where it is, including whatever it is between two people walking home from the movies. How patient they are. The old man smokes a pipe and spits. The young man is thinking he would be rich if he were already rich and had a mule. 10 days of hauling, and on the 7th day they'll probably be caught, go home empty-handed or worse. I don't know if they're Japanese or Mycenaean, and there's nothing I can do. The path from here to that village is not translated. A hero dying gives off stillness to the air. A man and a woman walk from the movies to the house in the silence of separate fidelities. There are limits to imagination. In today's Sunday Times, there's an essay by a guy on deconstruction, which is philosophical French, a movement in French thought, psychoanalysis, social science, literary analysis, which you can read about and paraphrase for yourself, but one of the main ideas of it is that human experience is basically unrecoverable through language. And so the claim that that any meaning has any stability at all is nonsense, crazy. The fact, if we had what we wanted, we wouldn't have language. Only, baby wants a mother's breast, goes, wah, wah, is the fact that he doesn't have his mother's breast, which is all any of us ever really want. We've constructed this immense Tower of Babel because we don't have that nipple in our mouths. If we did, we'd just shut up. The world would be silent and complete. And instead, it's talky and tormented. Anyway, about years ago, a friend of mine just back from France, very excited, explained this attitude to me, which I found incredibly depressing. He was very cheerful about it for whatever reason. And it was when I was thinking about this thing, about the man and the woman in the poem who walk home, each thinking their own thought. Separate thoughts, separate lives. All the new thinking is about loss. In this, it resembles all the old thinking. The idea, for example, that each particular erases the luminous clarity of a general idea. That the clown-faced woodpecker probing the dead sculpted trunk of that black birch is, by his presence, some tragic falling off from a first world of undivided light. Or the other notion that because there is in this world no one thing to which the bramble of blackberry corresponds, a word is elegy to what it signifies. We talked about it late last night, and in the voice of my friend there was a thin wire of grief, a tone almost querulous. After a while, I understood that talking this way, everything dissolved. Justice, pine, hair, woman, you, and I. There was a woman I made love to, and I remembered how, holding her small shoulders in my hands sometimes, I felt a violent wonder at her presence, like a thirst for salt, from my childhood river with its island willows, silly music from the pleasure boat, muddy places where we caught the little orange silver fish called pumpkin seed. It hardly had to do with her. Longing, we say, because desire is full of endless distances. I must have been the same to her, but I remember so much. The way her hands dismantled bread, the thing her father said that hurt her, what she dreamed. There are moments when the body is as numinous as words, days that are the good flesh continuing. Such tenderness, those afternoons and evenings, saying, blackberry, blackberry, blackberry. Da. As I say, I don't really have a plan. It's very complicated trying to write about place or figure out how to write about it. And I think that I thought that the way to do it was to tell the stories of a place, to try to represent the imagery of a place in some literal way. Many of the titles of the poems in my first book are just the names of places around my part of Northern California. And later, I came to feel like that the very effort to the conscious effort to make a regional poetry was not the way that happened. That it happened when the imagery became so natural that it became the imagery for particular emotions, just in the natural way of things. Do you know what I mean? If you say, it was my inclination to say, here are the typical birds of California, the brown, not your eastern blue jay and robin and so on, but the brown towhee and the chestnut-backed chickadee and the western bluebird on posts on spring mornings, in some literal way to name all of the things. And it was only later that it occurred to me that as I had absorbed that stuff and it just came into my imagery out of common experience, that it would have more of its authentic force as an aspect of a lived-in place. You follow me? In other words, when I said, oh look, there's the famous California bird, the brown towhee. But when I said, well, here's a poem in which the towhee comes in. It's called Child Naming Flowers, if I can find it. When old crones wandered in the woods, I was the hero on the hill in clear sunlight. Death's hounds feared me. Smell of wild fennel, high loft of sweet fruit high in the branches of the flowering plum. Then I am cast down into the terror of childhood, into the mirror and the greasy knives, the dark wood pile under the fig trees in the dark. It is only the malice of voices, the old horror that is nothing, parents quarreling, somebody drunk. I don't know how we survive it. On this sunny morning in my life as an adult, I am looking at one clear, pure peach in a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe. It is all the fullness that there is in light. A towhee scratches in the leaves outside my open door. He always does. A moment ago, I felt so sick and so cold, I could hardly move. I don't know if that, for me, I felt like I guess if there's a point there, and I'm not sure the point is the point, that when the towhee comes into the poem, just because it happens to be there, and is a sort of tutelary spirit of just every day going out and scratching, of just sort of normal life, instead of a representation of my beloved place or loved and hated place, that it has a kind of force. Reality. Rilke says that the task of human beings is to take in their world with such attention that it's not so lonely when it's given back again. You pass things through the world of spirit by naming them in language or in art, by soaking them in it and giving it back. You make the kind of songs that make the world livable and not so strange, not so alien and dangerous. This is, so I'm drifting here through this. This is a poem about New York City called Vintage, which my kids call my Woody Allen poem. Trying to write about a place. They had agreed, walking into the delicatessen on 6th Avenue, that their friends' affairs were focused and saddened by massive projection. Movie screens in their childhood were immense, and someone had proposed that need was unlovable. The delicatessen had a chicken salad with chunks of cooked chicken in a creamy basil mayonnaise, a shade lighter than the Coast Range in August. It was gray outside, February. Eating with plastic forks, walking and talking in the sleety afternoon, they passed a house where Juna Barnes was still reportedly making sentences. Basho said, "Avoid adjectives of scale. You will love the world more and desire it less." And there were other propositions to consider: childhood, vista vision, a pair of wet, mobile lips on the screen, at least 8 feet long. On the corner, a blind man with one leg was selling pencils. He must have received a disability check, but it didn't feed his hunger for public agony, and he sat on the sidewalk, slack-jawed with a tin cup, his face and opaque eyes turned upward in a look of blind, questing pathos. Half Job, half mole. Would the good Christ of Manhattan have restored his sight and 2/3 of his left leg? Or would he have healed his heart and left him there in his mutilated body? And what would that piece feel like? It makes you want, at this point, a quick cut or a reaction shot. The taxis rivered up 6th Avenue. A little sunlight touched the steeple of the First Magyar Reformed Church. In fact, the clerk in the liquor store where we tried to buy the wine was appalled. "No, no," he said, "that Cabernet can't be drunk for another 5 years." The form of that poem was some way an effort to get at the ways that in Manhattan, the sheer weight of stuff coming at you, and I wondered if I could slow it down for California. And this is called Late Spring. And then in mid-May, the first morning of steady heat, The morning leaf says when you wake up, put on shorts and that's it for the day. When you pour coffee and walk outside, blinking in the sun. Strawberries have appeared in the markets and peaches will soon. Squid is so cheap in the fish stores you begin to consult Japanese and Italian cookbooks for the various and ingenious ways of preparing ika and calamari. And because the light will enlarge your days, your dreams at night will be as strange as the jars of octopus you saw once in a fisherman's boat under the summer moon. And after swimming white wine, and the sharing of stories before dinner is prolonged because the relations of the children in the neighborhood have acquired village intensity and the stories take longer telling. And there are the nights when the fog rolls in that nobody likes. Hey fog, the Miwok sang, who lived here first, you better go home. Pelican is beating your wife. And after dark, in the first cool hour, your children sleep so heavily in their beds, exhausted from play, it is a pleasure to watch them. Leaf does not move a muscle as he lies there. No, wait, it is Luke who lies there in his 8-year-old body. Leaf is taller than you are, and he isn't home. When he is, his feet will extend past the end of the mattress, and Kristen is at the corner in the dark talking to neighborhood boys. Things change. There is no need for this dream-compelled narration. The rhythm will keep me awake, changing. This poem well, I was experimenting, if I can find them, I was experimenting with prose poems. Some of which return in one way or another to the theme of, are they here? Yeah. To the theme of, I don't know, whatever theme is involved in that guy with the beggar with the leg. I guess sometimes I think about, somebody came up to me and said, you've been writing a lot of poems lately about mutilation. I said, thank you. That's true. This one is called A Story About the Body, and it's a prose poem. I was writing a lot of prose, and I started experimenting with writing just short little narrative prose paragraphs that I hope had some of the condensation and intensity of poetry. This one is called A Story About the Body. The young composer, working that summer at an artist's colony, had watched her for a week. She was Japanese, a painter, almost 60, and he thought he was in love with her. He loved her work, and her work was like the way she moved her body, used her hands, looked at him directly when she made amused and considered answers to his questions. One night, walking back from a concert, they came to her door, and she turned to him and said, I think you would like to have me. I would like that too, but I must tell you that I've had a double mastectomy. And when he didn't respond, I've lost both my breasts. The radiance that he had carried around in his belly and chest cavity, like music, withered very quickly. And he made himself look at her when he said, I'm sorry, I don't think I could. He walked back to his own cabin through the pines, and in the morning he found a small blue bowl on the porch outside his door. It looked to be full of rose petals, but he found, when he picked it up, that the rose petals were on top. The rest of the bowl, she must have swept them from the corners of her studio, was full of dead bees. This one is very oblique. I don't know if it'll appeal to you. It appealed to me. It's called In the Bahamas. The doctor looked at her stitches thoughtfully. A tall, lean, white man with an English manner. Have you ever watched your mum sew? He asked. fellow who did this hadn't. I like to take a tuck at the last stitch. That way the skin doesn't bunch up at the ends. Of course, you can't see the difference, but you can feel it. Later, she asked him about all the one-armed and one-legged black men she kept seeing in the street. Diabetic gangrene, mostly. There really isn't more of it here than in your country, but there's less prosthesis. It's expensive, of course, and stumps are rather less shocking when you come right down to it. Well, as we say, there's nothing colorful about the Caribbean. He tapped each black thread into a silver basin as he plucked it out. Have you ever been to Haiti? Now, there's a truly appalling place. Finally, I'll read 3 more poems. I have a lot more poems about odd little deformities, and so I thought that this is a more positive poem on the same theme. And it's called The Novelist Among the Courbets at the Louvre. Someone else noticed her, looking and looking again. I think that's her. And it was. The book jacket face belonged to a slim woman in gray slacks and a cardigan sweater. The trimness and elegance of her figure were not surprising, or the head tilted to the angle of consideration, or the hauteur of the profile, or the gray streaks in the handsomely cut hair. What surprised them, in a woman of 55, was the lavish, summery curve of her hips. Even the guard, inured to every kind of human variety, watched her for a while. She had a great ass. It seemed at odds somehow, not only with her moral fierceness, but with what must have been a thin and fretful quality in her childhood, which her prose, brilliant as it was, had not quite got rid of in 30 years. She was moving slowly from picture to picture of massive, somber, and darkening life. The heaviness of the paintings was an anthem or a dirge, and beneath them she looked contemplative and almost frail, one of those small, sturdy persons to whom birth had given the riddle of suffering. Okay. Now, back to California, and I'll read 3 more poems, which I think will take about 5 minutes. I write a lot about my children. Morning sun on the south side of the house, just outside the kitchen door, arrived early in summer. When Luke was 4 or 5, he would go out there still in his dandelion yellow pajamas on May mornings and lie down on the first warm stone. For years, when peaches appeared in the markets and the green nubs of apricots on the backyard tree, I thought about a bench in that spot, a redwood screen behind green brushstrokes of bamboo. One April, I walked into the kitchen and felt like a stranger to my life, and it scared me. So when the gray doves returned to the telephone wires and the lemons were yellowing and no other task presented itself, I went into the garden and finally started digging, trying to marry myself and my hands to that place. Leaf comes home from the last day of his sophomore year. I am sitting on the stoop of our half-dug, still imagined kitchen porch, reading Han Dynasty rhyme prose. He puts a hand on my shoulder, grown to exactly my height and still growing. Dad, he says, I'm not taking any more of your tyrannical bullshit. I read to him from Chia Ya. The great man is without bent. A million changes are as one to him. And another thing, he says, don't lay your Buddhist trips on me. The span of life is faded. Man cannot guess its ending. In stillness, like the stillness of deep springs. In the kitchen, he flips the lid of the blueberry yogurt. I am thinking this project is more work than I want. Joining, scattering, ebbing and flowing. Where is their persistence? Where is their rule? Bullshit, he mutters. What is the existential reality? He has read nausea in advanced English of all this bullshit. Toto. Toto is the dog. It occurs to me that I am not a very satisfying parent to rebel against. Like an unmoored boat, drifting aimlessly, not even valuing the breath of life, the wise man embraces nothing and drifts with it. I look at his long body in a chair and wonder if I tell him to embrace a void. I think he will embrace a lover soon. I want the stars to terrify him once. I want him to weep bitterly when his grandfather dies, hating the floral carpet in the mortuary, hating it that his old aunts have become experts at an obscene event. Digging again, I say, you know, I started this job and I hate it already and now I have to finish. He leans against the doorpost with a spoon, takes a mouthful. Well, Pop, he says, that's life. These are two poems of the summer mountains, and they're, again, maybe efforts to pass the stuff of my world through other kinds of emotions. Thin air. What if I did not mention death to get started, or how love fails in our well-meaning hands, or what my parents, in the innocence of their malice toward each other, did to me? What if I let the light pour down on the mountain meadow, mule ears dry already in the August heat, and the sweet, heavy scent of sage rising into it, marrying what light it can, a wartime marriage. Summer is brief in these mountains. The ticker tape parade of snow will bury it in no time, in the excess the world gives up here, and down there, you want snow. I'm going to stop and say, this poem is, so you know what you're hearing a little bit, which I think helps. This poem is 3 pages long, and it falls through itself. It falls through itself. I've been reading a younger Polish poet named Adam Zagajewski, who I'm completely in love with right now, and his poems just do this. I think you might have trouble knowing exactly where you are in the poem, but in a way that's the point, so just go with it. What if I did not mention death to get started, or how love fails in our well-meaning hands, or what my parents in the innocence of their malice toward each other did to me? What if I let the light pour down on the mountain meadow, mule ears dry already in the August heat, and the sweet, heavy scent of sage rising into it, marrying what light it can? A wartime marriage. Summer is brief in these mountains. The ticker tape parade of snow will bury it in no time, in the excess the world gives up there. And down here, you want snow. You think you have seen infinity, watching the sky shuffle the pink cards of 30,000 flamingos on the Sengaretti plains. This is my blush, she said, turning toward you, eyes downcast demurely, a small smile playing at her mouth. Playing what? Playing house? Playing I am the sister and author of your sorrow? Playing the Lord God loves the green earth and I am a nun of his visitations. You want snow? I'll give you snow, she said. This is my flamingos in migration blush. Winter will bury it. You had better sleep through that cold, or sleep in a solitary room in a city where the stone glistens darkly in the morning rain. You are allowed a comforter, silky in texture, though it must be blue. and you can listen to music in the morning, the notes nervous as light reflected in a fountain, and you can drink your 1 cup of fragrant tea and rinse the cup and sweep your room, and the sadness you are fighting off while the gulls' calls beat about the church towers out the window, and you smell the salt smell of the sea is the dream you don't remember of the meadow sleeping under 15 feet of snow, though you half recall the tracks of some mid-sized animal, a small fox or a large hare, and the deadly silence and the blinded eye gray of the winter sky. It is sleeping, the meadow. Don't wake it. You have to go to the bottom of the raveling of life that didn't take, floating in the smell of alcohol, or the old man in the bed spitting up black blood like milk of the other world, the surgical pan, the pump, or the way you have to go to the bottom of the raveling, the surgical pan and the pump and the bits of life that didn't take, floating in the smell of alcohol, or the old man in the bed spitting up black blood like milk of the other world, or the way middle-aged women from poor countries are the ones who clean up after and throw the underwear away. Hang on to the luxury of the way she used to turn to you. Don't abandon it. Summer is short. No one ever told you differently. This is a good parade. This is the small hotel, the boathouse on the dock, and the moon thin, just silvering above the pines. And you are starting to sweat now, having turned north out of the meadow and begun the ascent up Granite and through buckthorn to the falls. There is a fine film on your warm skin that you notice. You are water, light and water and thin air, and you're breathing deeply now. A little dead marmot like a rag of auburn hair swarms with ants beside the trail, and you can hear the rush of water in the distance as it takes its leap into the air and falls. In the winter city, she is walking toward you or away from you, the fog condensing and dripping from the parapets of old apartments, or from the memory of intimate garments that dried on those balconies in summer, even in the spring. Do you understand? You can brew your tea and you can drink it. The leaves were grown in Ceylon. The plump young man who packed them was impatient. He is waiting for news of a scholarship to Utrecht. He is pretty sure he will rot in this lousy place if he doesn't get it. And you can savor the last sip, rinse the cup, and put it on the shelf, and then you can go outside, or you sit down at the desk, you go into yourself, the sage scent rising in the heat. Same mountain in imagination there, on Squaw Peak. I don't even know which sadness it was came up in me when we were walking down the road to Shirley Lake, the sun gleaming in snow patches, the sky so blue it seemed the light dove of some Pentecost of blue, the mimulus yellow, delicate of petal, and the pale yellow cinquefoil trembling in the damp air above the creek, and fields of lupin, that blue blaze of lupin, a swatch of paintbrush sheening it, and so much of it, long meadows of it, gathered out of the mountain air and spilling down ridge toward the lake it almost looked like in the wind. I think I must have thought the usual things, that the flowering season in these high mountain meadows is so brief, that the feeling, something like hilarity, of sudden pleasure when you first come across some tough little plant you knew you'd see, comes because it seems, I mean by it the larkspur or pen stem and curling and arching the reach of its sexual being up out of a little crack in granite, to say that human hunger has a niche up here in the light cathedral of the dazzled air. I wanted to tell you that when the ghost child died, the 3-month dreamer she and I would never know, I kept feeling that the heaven it went to was like the inside of a store window on a rainy day from which you watch the blurred forms passing in the street. Or to tell you, more terrible, that when she and I walked off the restlessness of our misery afterwards in the Coast Range hills, we saw come out of the thicket shyly a pure white doe. I wanted to tell you I knew it was a freak of beauty, like the law of averages that killed our child and made us know, as you had said, that things between lovers, even of longest standing, can be botched in the body, even if their wills don't fail. Still later, on the beach, we watched the waves, no two the same size, no two in the same arch of rising up and pouring, but it was the same law. You shell a pea, there are 3 plump seeds and one that's shriveled. You shell a bushelful, and you begin to feel the rhythm of the waves at Limantour, glittering, jagged, that last bright October afternoon. It killed something in me, I thought, or froze it, to have to see where beauty came from. I imagined for a long time that our baby, since it would have liked to smell our clothes, to know what a mother and father would have been, hovered sometimes in our closet. And I half expected to see it there, half fish spirit, form of tenderness, little dead dreamer with open eyes. That was private sorrow. I tried not to hate my life, to fear the frame of things. I knew what 2 people couldn't say on a cold November morning in the fog. You remember the feel of Berkeley winter mornings. What they can't say to each other is the white deer not seen. It meant to me that beauty and terror are intertwined so powerfully and go so deep that any kind of love can fail. I didn't say it. I think the mountain startled my small grief. Maybe there wasn't time. We may have been sprinting to catch the tram because we had to teach poetry in that valley 2,000 feet below us. You were running. Gabe's mother, David's lover, mother and lover grieving of a girl about to leave for school and die to you a little, or die into you, or simply turn away. And you ran like a gazelle in purple underpants, royal purple. And I laughed out loud. It was the abundance the world gives, the more than you bargained for surprise of it, waves breaking, the sudden fragrance of the mimulus at Creekside, sharpened by the summer dust. Things bloom up there. They are, for their season, alive in those bright epiphanies of air we ran through. Okay. Thank you.
This video cassette is not to be reproduced in any manner, way, or form. Property of the Scranton Public Library.